Hello everyone and welcome to the February tutorial for my channel. In our painting this month, I am creating this painting of oranges from this image on Pixabay, and I provided the author's name of the photo below if you'd like to look him up. This lesson will occur in 3 stages. First we will do the sketch, then we will do color blocking, and then the details and the finish. I'm using several materials for this tutorial. I'm using an 8x10" canvas panel in Liquin Original, Gamblin Artist Colors in Prussian Blue, Yello Ocher, Cadmium Yellow, Cadmium Red, Mars Black, Titanium White, and Burnt Sienna for the underpainting. And I'm also using a variety of round and flat brushes, but of course these are not required to finish this painting, and you should use what you have. For the sketch, as usual, I'm posting the sketch here. If you'd like to screenshot it, you can use that to sketch. I've used vine charcoal and I've sketched out on the canvas panel with burnt sienna, which is thinned with Gamsol. And what I'm doing when I am sketching is I'm first of all just trying to get the lines down and to get the information where it needs to be on the canvas to make a plan for myself. The first thing I like to do is to go through and to outline the shapes, and then once I have the outline composed, I'll go back through and I'll look for my areas of darkest color and my areas of highlight so that I can start to plan them out. The reason that I like to have the sketch in the thinned oil color is, first of all, it takes away that kind of fear of having a whiteness of the page or whiteness of the canvas. um, but it also allows you to think a little bit about the composition and to just practice the shapes and the approach so that you have a strong plan for moving forward. And it helps also to build confidence because you've already done the basics for the painting once. You have an idea of where you want to put specific elements, and you start to plan, as I mentioned, where those darkest darks and those lightest lights will be. So I am going to show you my overall process for the sketch, and also how I kind of go about adding these elements in, and you can follow along. Of course, if you'd like to change anything in the sketch, now would be a great time. You might decide that you want to have more leaves or less leaves, or you would like your painting brighter or darker. And this is a great opportunity to kind of play with those elements as you move forward. I am finishing up on the sketch now and just making those final placements for moving forward with the painting. Sometimes, depending on how much time I have for a specific sketch, I will allow the underpainting or the sketch to dry. Other times, I will go right into the painting. This particular beginner tutorial is an alla prima, which means all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting while this sketch or this underpainting is still wet. And what you will find that this does is it does help to tone the colors, because you will start to pick up some of the burnt sienna from the palette. That's something to consider. I like to do this especially when I'm doing portraits, because it helps to bring a richer tone to the skin color. For the leaves and the oranges, it's not going to be too much of a problem, but it does help to just bring kind of another level of color to the overall sketch. For the leaves, you'll see that it it brings a little bit of a darker or a darkness. It desaturates the color just a little bit for those first initial layers. So my finished sketch is just about ready, and as you can see, I've decided to bring in a little bit more darkness, especially over on the right side. The second stage is the blocking stage, and this is the stage where we add in the initial colors throughout. I'm starting with Prussian Blue, Yello Ocher, and a Mars Black, because I want to get those deepest shadows in the initial sketch. This is important because this is where we begin to get the recesses of the painting, or to start to create distance in the painting with our use of color. And so there's not really a true black in the reference photo. Instead, it's a very, very deep kind of bluish green. So as I'm mixing, I'm playing with the color to try to get this kind of bluish green color. And I'll show as I'm mixing, and I've also posted the colors that I'm using on the bottom to kind of help those of you who are following along. When you add in any kind of black, especially the Mars Black, which tends towards kind of a dark blue, you want to be very sparing, because it tends to take over the color quite quickly. So you'll see that I've mixed the blue and the black, and adding in a bit of yellow, and just kind of trying it on the canvas to see how the colors look, and to see if I'm in the right ballpark for that dark greenish blue shadow color in the painting. There are some artists who do like to pre-mix their colors, and pre-mixing can be very, very helpful. I find that I enjoy mixing as I go along, which does mean that there are variations in color, but I also enjoy how, when you're looking at something in real life, there are going to be variations of color. So continuing to mix on the palette as you move forward is one way to continue to modify and to have those variations of color. If you are someone who likes to pre-mix, or has more confidence when you pre-mix your colors, that is a perfectly fine way to go about the painting. What I would suggest is starting with a light, a medium, and a dark of each of your colors to help as you start to add depth and add shadow. And then once you start to blend, you'll get more variations as well. But having a dark, a light, and a medium tone will start to bring dimension to the elements that you're painting. So that's one tip that I can offer. And you'll see that as I mix, and as I start to pull my paint out into various piles, I do aim to have that dark, that medium, and that light. So here I am just continuing to go in and look for those areas of darkness. These will be the deepest parts of the painting where the sunlight is not shining through the canopy of leaves in this tree. And I want to start there because it gives me a point of reference for the midtones, but also for the lightest light colors in the painting. Now that I have those initial dark shades put in, and I will go back and modify these as I work on the painting, I want to start to think about where those little peeps of sky are coming through. And so in order to do that, I am mixing titanium white and Prussian blue. And the titanium white and the Prussian blue will be helpful in having that kind of sky blue color. I do end up desaturating it just a little bit with the slightest hint of cadmium red. You don't want to put so much in that it turns the paint purple, but you want to just have that little bit of a drop, and it brings more depth. And I do apologize, my mall stick is kind of blocking the color mixing here, but you'll see it when I put it on the palette. And what I'm doing here is I'm just establishing the peeps of color or the peeps of sky that will be present throughout the painting. And when you look at the image, the reference image or the inspiration image, you'll see that there are various shades of the sky as well. So we want to kind of follow that along, and just like we did with the darks, or will do with the darks, we want to have a dark, a midtone, and a light of the sky. So I'm just kind of eyeballing the reference photo and adding in these areas, starting with the darkest areas of sky, and then I will progress to the lightest areas of sky. And you will be continuing to refine these colors and to refine these shapes. For the blocking, what we want to do is just get those shapes and those shadings in, so that when we come back and do the detail in the alla prima, we will add more of that depth and tighten up these various areas as they work together. Here I am going back in and adding that lightness, and that's where you can see the most sky through the leaves as you're looking into the back of the tree. I like to start with the background on the painting, and this is something that I mentioned in the poodle tutorial that I posted last week, because the way that the colors work on the painting is that they change in how we understand color based on the colors that are next to it. So I can put the same blue down on a white canvas next to something that's gray or orange or purple, and it's going to look different than it will with this particular combination of colors. So I find that starting with the background helps me to more accurately predict and color mix for those paintings that we want, or those elements of the painting that we want the eye to focus on. And so that is why whenever doing an alla prima, starting with the background is a great way to have better color accuracy. There's nothing worse than painting everything just as you want it for a portrait or for a still life, and then going and putting the background in and noticing that it has either made your colors look super saturated or it has dulled your colors out. So starting with the background is one thing that I do quite often as I move forward with my paintings, because I find that it helps me to have a more accurate and a better color mixing. Now that I have those initial shades in, I'm going to go in and start to think about the green. There are many different variations of green in this painting, and the green is very important because it is what is going to add the depth of the tree, so that it looks like we're looking back into the tree with the oranges sitting on top, the brightest leaf sitting on top, and then the colors kind of deepen or dull as they go back. So I'm spending a bit of time here mixing what will become the darkest green for those leaves. And this is mostly going to be Prussian Blue and Yello Ocher with a small bit of that Mars Black. I have decided to use Mars Black for this painting because, as I mentioned, when it's mixed with a white, it becomes a more grayish blue. So that blue tone lends really well to the leaves. And as I start to put in these darker colors, I think about which leaves are set furthest back in the painting or are in shadow, and which leaves are closest to the viewer of the painting. The closest leaves are going to have the most detail and the most vibrant color, and those that are farthest back are going to, of course, have this darker color. I also want to think about the color variation on the leaves themselves. So if you look at the reference photo, you'll notice that some of the leaves have a kind of dappled or spotted appearance. And of course, that means we need to have that darkest dark color in the background in order to make those midtones and those lights pop when we go in and start to do the detail on the leaves. So we want to hit those furthest away, and then we also want to think about where the colors are laying on the leaves themselves. This is where the sketch comes in really handy, because that can become overwhelming to think about each or to think about it all together. But if you think about each leaf individually, if you go back and you look at your sketch and then you look at the painting and you try to fill in the areas as you move across the areas, it makes it a bit more manageable. There are some artists who do like to complete one element of the painting before moving to the next. So they might do one complete leaf or one complete orange and then move to the next. And that is a great way to approach a painting. But for me personally, I find that I like to bring the painting up together. So doing the blocking allows you to make sure that you have everything covered, that you have all of your basic colors there, and then you can bring up the painting together with details, because you'll notice that sometimes an area looks really great, but then when you do another area, it's not as focused or doesn't have as much details, or the colors aren't quite like you like them. So bringing up the painting together or holistically is a great way to approach that problem. So I will just continue to add in these darks, and you can see that as I'm moving to the leaves that are closer to the viewer, I'm starting to add in more of the yellow ochre, and this is lightening the paint a bit as I move forward. Now I am starting to add in the lightest colors, and you'll see that what I've done here is I've continued to pull from those piles where I mixed the yellow ochre, the Prussian blue, and now I've added in the cadmium yellow, which is a much brighter, more saturated yellow, and I'm using this yellow to get a third tone of green, and this is the tone that I am putting around the outside of the leaves, and I will eventually blend this together with the darker tone. This is not the last color of green for the leaves. We will of course revisit this in the detail stages, but adding in the cadmium helps to just to bring that color up even brighter for the overall leaf arrangement. And I am being sure to add this brightest color to all of the leaves which are at the forefront of the painting. I will also go back in later once I've done the majority of the work on the painting and add in stems, and when I add in the stems I will be using this brightest color as well. And you can see that as I am adding the color and blending them together, it's slightly changing the color on my brush, it's slightly changing the color on my palette. Sometimes I add a little bit more cadmium yellow in, but allowing those colors to mix together just really gives that great variation. And we want to be thinking about how the leaves are laying on top of one another. Where would those areas of shadow be? Where would those areas of recess be, so that we can keep those and not blend those out as we're adding in colors. And you can always go back and add them in at the end of the painting just to provide a bit more direction for the viewer, and you'll notice things as you bring up the painting that you may have missed previously, but just getting in these basic shapes is key. Now that I've gotten those basic shapes in, I am going back and working on filling in more of the background. So I'm thinking about the lightest of the tree canopy in the back and how I can add in more variations of darks and midtones to get that kind of dappled look. And this is something that I am going to continue to play with and to experiment with until I get to the end of the painting, because it's not necessarily an area of focus, but having these nice dappled or out of focus areas is going to help to make the oranges pop off even more on the canvas. So look at the photo and think about where these areas of darkness and lightness are laying in this back, I guess we could call it kind of blotchy area of the painting. One thing that you can do to help with this is to squint your eyes. And when you squint your eyes, you're going to see the colors and the shapes, but not so much the elements of the photo, and that can be really helpful. I'm also making sure that I've moved the color to the end of the canvas panel. And one thing that's really helpful in drawing the reader's eye in is being sure to put the darkest colors around the edges, because what that's going to do is that's going to help the eye to focus in on those brighter colors in the middle. So you'll see that even though it's not necessarily in the reference photo, I do go back and I kind of add those dark lines, especially in the corners and on the edges, and I will kind of blend those in to help give it a bit of a vignette look in the final piece. So I will continue to work on the background, think about those areas of darkness, think about those areas of light, squint my eyes, and move forward with continuing to develop the background of the picture. And this can take a little bit of time, especially when you're putting the colors down for the first time. The subsequent layers do become easier because you're mixing colors together. But just take your time, squint your eyes, think about what you're seeing, think about where the colors are going, and remember, you can always go back and refine. have the background completed, the blocking stage, I'm going to start to work on the oranges. And for the oranges, I'm using first a cadmium red and a yellow ochre to mix what will be my darker color. Then I will move to a mid-tone color and finally finish with the lighter color. And what is most important when doing a round object or painting a round object is to consider the light source and where the light is hitting and where the object would be in the shade, because we create the roundness by thinking through the light source and how light is hitting the object. I will also, you can see here in the corner, I have smeared a little bit more of the cadmium yellow, and I will mix this in towards the end of the orange painting session. I like to start by thinking through where those deepest elements will be, as I did with the leaves. So I am putting the orange color in these areas by looking at the reference photo. I'm also, as I have been in the previous stages, mixing just the smallest drop, barely putting the brush in to the Liquin original to help spread the paint as a painting medium. If you are also using Liquin original, the great thing about it is not only does it help to make the paint more manageable, but it also helps the paint to dry a little bit faster. So if you would, as you continue to practice, like to paint something that you work on in several sessions, the Liquin original can continue to help you with the drying time so that you don't need to wait as long between sessions. But you just want to be really careful when you use it so that you're not using too much, because it can make the paint shiny and kind of plasticky, which is not the effect that we want to have with oil paint. So I'm working by putting the darkest colors into those shaded areas. On the bottom of this orange, there is a bit of greenness where the orange is still ripening up. So I want to be sure to leave some space to add that in. And I'm also going into the second orange and also hitting those darkest colors where the orange is shaded by the canopy of leaves at the top. One thing we want to think about as we're starting to block these colors in is how we're incorporating these oranges with the background. And so we want to have soft edges. We don't want to have a hard, distinctive line edge like we had when we made the sketch. We want to have those soft edges so that the colors blend together, because that is how we would see in life. We don't see outlines around things when we look at things in life. So you'll see that I'm kind of taking the brush and I'm mixing that outer layer in with the orange, and I'm going to come back with a blending brush in a little while and soften that out even more. So if you do notice that you have those hard lines from your sketch, and you can see where I have some of them left in the leaves, that's something that we'll work on as we continue to refine and add in more colors. I'm now going back and adding in the mid-tone, or that middle color of orange, and this is just cadmium red with more yellow ochre mixed in, and I'm starting to work towards the rounder parts of the orange, so the parts that are approaching the light. As the roundness of the orange gets closer to the viewer, we're going to have more of that yellowness or that lightness come through, and that's what starts to give us the impression or the illusion of having shape. So I'm blocking those colors in, and then actually at this point I'm starting to kind of blend the colors a little bit as I put them in, and as I get to the higher points on the orange, the points that are closest to the viewer, I am adding even more and adding in some of the cadmium yellow as well to continue to refine and create that. So what's most important to me here is putting in those basic colors and filling in the shape so that I can go back and I can start to refine and add more details in later. At this point, I'm adding in that bit of brown that I mentioned. It's kind of a greenish brown where the orange is still ripening. And in order to do that, I'm just mixing a little bit of the orange color, a little bit of the yellow ochre in with some of that darkest green, and then blending it out. And you can decide as you look at the painting how dark you want to make this. It's a bit darker near the center part where the blossom of the fruit was, that little knob, and it fades out. So you can decide how prominent you want to make this if you want to add it in. I feel that it helps to give the orange a bit more dimension, and so that's why I've decided to put it in. And there's also just the smallest hint of it on the second orange as well. So adding in these colors and just kind of blending them out so that they can fade away is really helpful. Here I'm going back in with the white and I'm just starting to add a hint of that highlight. We always want to save the brightest brights for the last part of painting. So this is really just kind of an indicator of where those highlights will go. And you can see as I put in the titanium white, it's actually blending with the orange that's already on the painting, and it starts to give it a nice kind of dappled or textured effect, which if you look at the skin of an orange, it has it's not completely smooth. It has those kind of small dimples throughout. once I've added in and blended out these white highlights, I'm going to go in with a blending brush. This is a mop brush, but any soft synthetic brush will work. And I'm fuzzing out those lines and making those lines less harsh. When you do this, just be sure, you can see that I've turned my brush there, just be sure that you're noticing what colors of paint are on your brush, because it's very easy to accidentally mix colors together. So just be mindful of what colors are on what side of your blending brush. I use a shop towel and continue to wipe the brush out between strokes. And so what I'm doing here is I'm just wanting to blend some of the harsher colors together and also make sure that I don't have any harsh lines between the shapes. And that will do a few things. First, it alleviates that kind of outline feel, but it also makes sure that there are no bare areas of canvas showing. The burnt sienna sketch can sometimes be, just depending on what colors you're putting on top of it, it can sometimes be a little dark. So blending out in this way can be really helpful. And we're going to go back and we're going to put in another layer of highlight, which is going to help with that, but just kind of getting those areas together. After I've done the more delicate parts like the orange and the leaves, I go back in and dress the background, make sure that I've covered up all areas of the canvas. And this background, as I've mentioned a few times, it's something that we will continue to go back and look at and refine as we move forward. But my main concern is just kind of making sure that all the colors are starting to move together and that there is no blank canvas showing. The last element that I need to address at this point in the painting is going to be the branch, or the stalk of the tree, the branch of the tree, and the reference image is showing this as just a very dark kind of brownish color. So I'm mixing this with a Prussian Blue, a Mars Black, and a Cadmium Red, and mixing the Mars Black and the red, or the Cadmium Red and the Prussian Blue together, would also give you kind of a dark brown color. And so I'm just adding this in. There's really not much to this branch. It needs to be there for the composition of the painting, but it's not a focal point. It does help the oranges to feel a little bit more three-dimensional. So I want to be sure that I am covering this area, that I'm getting this branch in, and that it's making sense with the overall composition, but there's not a terrible amount of detail. When we're making a composition like this, depending on how you want the viewer to interact with the painting, oftentimes the focal point will have the most detail and the rest of the painting kind of blends into the back. And that's something that I want to happen with this branch, and that is of course inspired by the original image. So I will continue to work on putting this branch in, and then I'm going to go back and kind of blend it out, make sure I covered all of the elements of the canvas, especially that little fork in the branch there. And I just actually do that by moving the color around a little bit here. Now that I have covered the canvas, I want to go in and continue to build up the form of the leaves, and I am doing this by mixing in even more cadmium yellow to that green. And you can see that I continue to add in colors and I continue to mix to get more of that variation. This is a very small painting. It's an 8 by 10 on a canvas panel. So I can mix the paint in small batches like this, and I'm going back over where some of that burnt sienna is coming through. And this is the point where we move from the blocking into the detail stage. So I can start to add my lightest colors. I'm adding a bit of titanium white into that green and cadmium yellow mix, and outlining the leaves where the leaves are the brightest color in the reference photo. And what this is going to do is it's going to show where the sunlight would be hitting on and illuminating these leaves, and it's also following kind of the natural pattern of the leaves. So continuing to look at the reference photo, you can see that as I'm painting, I pause and I'm looking at the photo and kind of squinting my eyes to see those colors. I'm going to go ahead and add in those lightest areas throughout to help define the shapes. And then once I have added in these, I'm pulling a little bit of that light color into the mid-tones and the darks that I've mixed on the leaf, and that's going to start to give the leaf a bit more shape and a bit more form. When we think about leaves, they're never just flat, but they kind of wave and they crinkle, and adding in these smaller areas of light and areas of dark help to create that form, just like we did with the oranges. So bringing in that kind of splotched or malted look on the leaves, and also giving it a bit more form with the waves and the lines. As we approach the final stage of details, we also want to think about the direction of our brush strokes. Of course, this is something that we'll keep in mind throughout the painting, but it becomes most important in the final stage because this is where we really see the work that we're doing with our brush strokes. So thinking about how the direction that the brush stroke is going in helps to direct the eye of the viewer. So we want those brush strokes to be kind of pointing in towards the oranges, or directing towards the oranges, which are going to be the most developed and most detailed part of the painting. And just continuing to be mindful of how we're putting that paint down to help direct the viewer. And you can see as we add in these details, it starts to bring up the painting and starts to make certain elements pop out. If you compare the leaves that I'm doing now with the leaves on the side that have only the two colors, there's a difference between them. There's a marked difference. We also want to continue to keep in mind as we're painting where those areas of shadow fall and where the sunlight would be hitting the leaves. And so continue to look at your reference photo, continue to kind of think through the painting and where the light would be coming from. As I move into these areas that would be a little bit darker, I continue to mix the light paint, but it's not as bright as it would be on the other side, where there is more sunlight. So also be mindful and be aware. If you move to these darker areas after you've kind of dealt with the midtones, you'll automatically have the darker paint mixed into your brush. And you'll also be picking up paint from the canvas as you move forward. So we start to see that we've specifically mixed four types of greens, but we have a lot of variation because of how the colors are mixing together on the palette and also on the canvas. So just continue to think through these leaves, think through where these areas of highlight and areas of darkness would be, and add them on. And I will show you stroke for stroke here what I'm doing, but don't be afraid to spend as much time as you need on this part of the painting, because these final details are what really finish the painting off and give it that painterly quality. I also want to continue to work on this leaf that's poking out between the oranges here. I don't feel like I've given it enough attention so far with the totality of the painting, so I'm bringing that a bit forward. And this leaf was important. I kind of went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to include it, but I like that it helps to separate the oranges a bit. As I mentioned earlier, once I start to go in with those darkest darks, or with the lightest lights, I also want to think about the branches or the stems in the tree and where these would be located. And so I'm going back in and I'm starting to add these stems, and there's not really much to it. There's not a lot of detail. We just want to give the impression of branches and stems and the edge of leaves, and so that it's not just a dark blotch of color, but so that there's more movement going on to give that illusion of a depth when you're looking into the trees. So just kind of use the photo as a reference and add in these elements where you feel they would be most helpful. The eye of the viewer is going to be mostly drawn into the oranges and those leaves directly surrounding the oranges, but adding in those smaller elements, even when they're not as detailed, help to create a more complete picture. This final area of the leaf is going to be straight cadmium yellow, and this may seem a bit bold or a bit bright, but just kind of going in and mixing the cadmium yellow at this point with the dark is just bringing another quality of green to the painting. So you can see here I'm kind of playing with that. And what I will do is I'm going to go back in and put some of those shadows that I feel were blended out a bit too much, especially for the center of the leaves. And if we think about the form of the leaf, um, by the stem in the middle is where the leaf would be deepest, with the outside of the leaf kind of furling out. So I want to go back in and add a little bit of that depth back in to make the leaf appear as if the surface has different levels or different depths, like you would see a leaf in nature. So kind of going back and approximating where these colors would be, and you can see that the stem is very, very wide here. I'm going to go back in and blend that out. And when you start to look at the reference image, you'll also notice that there is a bit of blue in this leaf, and we want to include the blue as a reflected light, and that's something that I'm going to do at the end of the painting, so I want to leave a little bit of room for that as well. So I'm just continuing to mix the cadmium in with that darkest dark green color that I had mixed there, and to kind of think about the form and the structure of the leaves as well as where the light is. And it's okay to go back in and add these darks, and even if you find that there's a leaf shape that you're not as happy with, now would be the time to go back in and refine. The wonderful thing about oils is that they're very forgiving, and you are able to continue to mix and continue to refine these shapes up until the end of the session. The only time that you really can't do that is when you allow the painting to dry, and you come back, and then you would just kind of be painting over to help refine in the next session. The Liquin does speed up the drying process, but you still have several hours before the paint becomes tacky, especially if you're using small quantities. For artists who like to have more of that malleability, you can use linseed oil instead, and that will keep the paints more um, wet longer. Here I am going ahead and adding in that blue, and the blue is just a bit of Prussian blue, the smallest bit of titanium white mixed in with that darkest of the green to add in that blue. And I actually probably could have gone a little bit lighter with the blue to help reflect the colors of the sky. But overall, I'm happy with how these little hints of blue came out. So I'm just going back and I'm looking at some key areas and thinking about where I can add in these colors. And adding in colors from other areas of the painting helps to unify the painting. So I have the blue in the shadows, I have the blue in the sky, and so bringing in the blue to the leaves as well works. I have the green in the orange on those parts that are still ripening, and that helps to blend that in with the leaves. And then, of course, we've got the cadmium yellow in the leaves and in the oranges as well. As you're starting out, you'll notice that each of my tutorials, I try to use a very limited palette of somewhere between 3 to 4, 5 colors. And that is because the more that you can learn to work within those constraints and the more practice you have mixing your colors, the more confident that you're going to be moving forward. There are some colors that can't be mixed from a limited palette, like certain kinds of blues or pinks. But for the most part, when doing still lifes and with doing portraiture, a limited palette works really well. So if you're a beginner and you're not quite sure where to start, you don't need to go out and buy 20 different paint colors. Just starting with a very small select palette is a great way to build up your skill and also learn more about color mixing. The first time I worked with a limited palette, I was very surprised at how, well, for example, for this painting, we were able to create so many shades of green without actually using a green plate, a paint, because we are using color mixing and we're using our blues and our yellows and mixing in the reds and the blacks. And it's fun to play with and it's fun to learn more about. You can see that in those deepest shadows, I'm going back to that kind of original blue-black mixture that we, that very dark green, bluish black that we mixed up to bring that depth back in to the layers of leaves. So I'll continue to work on this and just bring the details up in those leaves. Continue to look at your reference photo for those small details, and remember that it's an inspirational photo and not a direct copy. So this is where you can really put in your unique perspective as a painter as you make changes and as you decide what's most important, what's least important, what should be included, what shouldn't be included. So don't be afraid to make changes and to play and to experiment. If you end up not liking choices that you've made in your painting, you can always do it again. It's just practice, and this is just a canvas board. So it's great for just kind of playing around, experimenting, and learning. One thing that I've noticed as I've brought up these leaves is that the blue isn't shining through quite the way that I would want it to. So I'm coming back in and I'm just refining those areas of blue, thinking about where I'd like them to be a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, and where the blending of the colors will work better. So I'm adding a bit more of the dark blue into the corner, and this is because I want to draw the reader's eye into the focal point of the painting, and then I'll be adding lighter pops of blue towards the oranges, and this is basically mostly Prussian blue and titanium white, but I am picking up the colors from the painting as I move forward. You probably noticed that I've been using the exact same brush to paint the entire painting. When I move between colors, I just wipe it out. If I'm working on a more complicated painting or something that has more detail, I will use different brushes for the lights and for the darks, just because sometimes you don't want those colors to mix together. But for this Alla Prima painting, I've been using the same brush up until this point. So I'm just going to continue to add in those blues and bring up that color and make it a little bit brighter as I move forward. Now I'm continuing to work on the background by thinking through those blurred areas, the bokeh areas of the painting, and I'm adding in a bit more of the dark color. And if we think about the way that sunlight filters through leaves, we have these kind of dark under part of the leaf, or the dark part where the sunlight is blocked, and then we have the lightest part, which is highlighted by the sunlight. So I want to be sure that there's a good mix of that in the background, as well as the blue sky kind of peeking through, so that I give the illusion of kind of these leaves moving back and forth in the sunlight, catching the light, having that darkness, and it will give you the idea that the tree is much fuller as you kind of look towards the back of the painting. So I'm squinting my eyes, I'm stepping back from the painting and seeing how these dark colors and the light colors are kind of interplaying together. And I do spend a bit of time doing this and kind of going back and forth, and this is really the part of the painting where you just kind of start to do things by feel, what feels right to you as you're looking at the painting. There's no shame in, even though this is an alla prima painting, which means all at once, and even though the tutorial is only a little over an hour, there's no shame in stepping back from the painting, from taking a break, go get a cup of coffee, come back and you can see it with a little bit of fresh eyes, and that can be really helpful as well. It's something that I like to do. when I'm painting, especially if the session is a more intense session. So I'm coming back with that same mop brush. And of course, you can use any synthetic brush or any brush with soft hairs to do this. And I'm just blending those harsher lines together to kind of see what the overall effect is. And I'll continue to add in those lighter colors as I move forward. And what I want to do is I want to remove any kind of obvious harsh brush strokes and be sure that there are no kind of obvious blocking lines between the colors. I want to bring those colors together. And you can see it's very easy with the mop or with the blending brush to move those colors around. You can pick up a little bit of the light colors and move them to the dark, pick up the dark colors and move them to the light. And I'm just barely touching the surface of the painting with this brush. If I were to touch it too hard, I'd be starting to remove big swatches of paint, which could become a problem for me. Now that I am happier with how the background looks, I want to go back in with another layer of cadmium. And I'm taking that lighter layer of cadmium and I'm starting to add in more highlights to the oranges. So we don't want to just have the whitest white highlight, but we want to have some yellow as well to help build up that round form or that round shape. And so I'm just kind of thinking about where the light would be catching, where we would see that glint of sunlight off the orange. I also wanted to add the little nub where the orange connects to the branch. And so it's a little bit too light here. I'm going to go back in and darken that up in a minute with some of that dark orange paint, but just starting to add form. We mentioned earlier that we want to think about the brush strokes that we're using. While we were using longer strokes, we were establishing the leaves. Now we want to be using more of kind of a quick dash or a quick dot in the oranges as we're adding in these little tiles of color. And what that's going to do is it's going to help to mimic the surface of the orange. So we don't want to have these really long kind of fluid strokes, but we want to have these small dashes to kind of give that illusion of texture. And you can see that as I'm adding in, especially the light highlight colors, it's more of a dash or a quick kind of kiss against the canvas that I'm using. I'm also going back in and adding in a bit more of the green and the dark to help to establish those shadows so that they're a bit more obvious for the viewer. And you can go back and forth with this just depending on how dark you want those shadows to be and how recessed you want the oranges to be as you move forward. I also wanted to give some attention to this line between the oranges. Because the oranges are pressed up against each other, we have reflected light from the bottom orange to the top orange. And in the reference photo, this is almost a red color. So I'm coming back in with the cadmium red with a little bit of the yellow in, and I'm adding in those areas where the fruit are touching to have that deepest color. And then I also want to bring a little bit of that deep color into the first orange as well, just to have them complement each other a little bit. But this is just a hint of color, just a little bit to give more depth and more texture to the orange. And this should help to make them appear even rounder to the viewer. You can see that as I am kind of kissing the canvas or doing these small strokes, I'm also making sure that I'm kind of blending in the colors so that the colors don't stand out as like a polka dot on the surface, but instead um, mesh with each other. I also want to come back and add that highlight of sunlight right on the top of the orange to separate it a bit from that dark recessed area between the oranges where you have the reflected light. I am also going back in and I'm lightening up those greenish areas at the bottom of the orange as well. I felt they got just a little bit too green, so I want to lighten them up a bit as I move forward. As I move into the last 10 minutes or so of the painting, I am just double checking to see where else I might add in some areas of highlight or areas of darkness. And this is where I usually add back in either the darkest darks or the lightest of lights. So you can see that I'm just kind of going in and thinking about the shadow of, okay, this leaf would be behind the orange here and on top of the orange here. I also want to be sure that I've covered up any of the canvas tone that still might be appearing from the toning of the canvas with the burnt sienna. Don't have too much of that popping through, and because it mixes so well with the green and the orange of the oranges, I'm not too super worried about it, but I do want to go back and make sure that it's not obvious. I'm also finally dealing with that stem that was a bit too large, and just kind of bringing in more color and more dimension to the leaves. And as I mentioned, this is a part of the painting where you really could spend all day just adding in those little details, and depending on how far you want to take the painting. I find that when you are learning how to paint and when you're a beginner, just like you would with a creative writing exercise, giving yourself some constraints can be helpful, because then you know when you've reached a stopping point. So I'm going to work on the Alla Prima style. I'm only going to use 4 colors, and I'm going to allow myself to work for 1 hour. And then you can see where you are at the end of the hour. Is kind of a great way to not get overly frustrated and to continue to see these sessions as practice. Everything that you make does not need to be a masterpiece, although of course we're always open to that, because painting is fun, and we want what we make to be beautiful. But it also takes the pressure off us when we know that we're doing something for practice, and we're doing something to learn, and we're doing something to improve our skills. So if you find that you're getting frustrated, or you're not quite sure where to go in and add those details, or maybe no matter how many times you work at a leaf, it still looks funky. Sometimes just stopping and giving it a few days and coming back allows you to have a fresh perspective. It is also really helpful to think about not only those areas of problem in your painting, but also the areas that you feel you did really well, because you're going to carry that skill with you into your next painting, and you know where your areas of focus are. So for this painting, I'm very happy with how the oranges came out, especially that first orange, the orange on the bottom. I really like the way the colors blended together. I like the texture of the orange, so I'm celebrating that as a win. And if I were to do this painting again, I would probably want to focus a little bit more on separating those leaves, and using the original photo not so much as a template but more of an inspiration. So it's a good practice every time you finish a painting to think about, okay, what worked really well, and what do I want to try to do a little bit differently next time. And by doing that, you're also giving yourself certain skills to continue to focus on as you move forward with your work. For this painting, I'm continuing to go ahead and add in those brightest colors, thinking through where they would be appearing and where they would be catching the light. And I mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial that I continue to work on the background all the way until the end. And that is very, very true with how I have approached this work. And giving that final look, getting a little bit of that cadmium yellow, and then finally going back in with the whitest white and adding in that final highlight. And it feels really nice to add in that final highlight, because you know that you've approached the end of the painting, and that you are giving it that final kind of kiss. If you do find that the white is a little bit too white, you can always kind of go back in with your blending brush and tamp it down a little bit, which you're going to see I do on that top orange. It's just a little bit too bright for where it is placed in the painting. I hope that you've enjoyed painting along or watching along with this tutorial as I make these final adjustments. I am planning to post a new beginner alla prima tutorial each month this year is my personal goal. And each of these alla primas will be around an hour and using a limited palette. So I want to make it very easy for those of you who are learning oil painting to follow along at home. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I started learning oil painting about 3 years ago, and you can go back on my channel and you can see my progress and my practice over the years, and how my skills have changed as I've learned more about painting. And so I just want to share that with the painting community and to share what I have learned in my progress for those who are interested, and so that we can all improve our skills together. So I would love to hear what you think. If you follow along and you paint any of these tutorials, please post them and tag me and let me know. I also have an Instagram by the same name as my YouTube channel. I have a TikTok as well, where I post shorts of the different paintings and also other things that I'm working on that I'm not doing tutorials for. If you're interested in following along there, I would love to see what you're working on and have you share with me your progress as you learn more about painting too. Painting can be a very fun and a very rewarding hobby. You can surprise yourself with what you're able to do, especially when you put in even just one painting session a week. Your skills will continue to improve, and it's really neat to be able to take an image or take an idea and put it onto paper. So as you're learning, be easy with yourself. Remember that sometimes it's not so much about product, but it's about process, and it's about the time that you're putting into it, and the time that's an investment in you and an investment in yourself, and what you can learn from that as you move forward. Every painting that you paint is going to get better and better, and your skills are going to continue to increase, and you will continue to surprise yourself. So please do share. I would love to see what you're working on. And these are the last few little adjustments of the painting. I'm going back in and I'm adding that line of shadow back under where I have painted the bright sunlight highlights on the leaves, and just continuing to be sure that my items are separate enough for the viewer to understand what they're looking at. Here is leaves, adding that little bit more of dappling on some of the leaves and refining. This has been such a fun painting to try and to share with you, and I do hope, as I've mentioned, that you try it and that you tag me. Here is the finished painting, the reference image, so you can see we got pretty close. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you back for another tutorial. If you have any ideas of what you'd like to paint, please feel free to drop it in the comments, and I'll see what I can do. Thanks everyone, and have a great week.